Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well on this beautiful, glorious morning, day. I thought I would do a message, read a spiritual passage for everyone. Um, Please look out in a couple days for my Spirit Sage intuitive energy reading, which is designed to kind of bring messages directly from the divine, from source, in terms of, specific messages, important messages, omens, predictions, etc. Just knowledge that we should be mindful of during this period. Now, I was led to do the spiritual message today because this is a very intense period. It's a lot of revelations, a lot of changes, a lot of separation energy. Those who are on their path toward ascension, those who are still dwelling in 3D energies. There's a separation energy within families, within partnerships, within love relationships. There is a major shift happening with divine counterparts. So there's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of information coming in, and a lot of people dealing with karma and judgment. So just to address these feelings that many are experiencing, what better day than to put this message out today? And the most important thing I want to make clear is that this is a very important, I would say, urgent time to address your karma, resolve your karma, and to detach from outcomes, from worldly possessions. That's not to say that we don't need to survive in this world, that we don't need to work hard, and God wants us all to be fruitful. But what is your intent? What is your purpose? Where is your heart? Because those are things that you cannot hide from the source, from God. You can't cheat the divine. So, detaching. Okay, so that's what I'm going to speak on today. This shouldn't be super long, just inspiration for everyone. Okay, so God's grace is incompatible with the love of worldly things. And God says, my child, my grace is precious and will not be mingled with earthly things or worldly consolations. You must get rid of every impediment if you would have that priceless gift poured into your soul. That precious gift is grace. Grace is a magnificent river, in my opinion. But continuing on, God says, choose a hidden place for yourself and delight to retire there alone, where you need not talk with anyone, but instead pour out your heart to God in prayer. In this way, you will have a clear conscience and a contrite heart. Look upon the whole world as nothing, preferring to give your time to God before all external things. You cannot fix your mind on me and at the same time delight in transitory pleasures. Friends and acquaintances must be kept at a distance, and your heart disengaged from all temporal comfort. When people are about to depart from this world, what confidence will be theirs at that moment if they are not detained by detachment to anything in this world? But a weak soul is yet incapable of detaching its heart perfectly from all things, nor can the carnal person understand the liberty of the spiritual person. Persons who would be truly spiritual must renounce both those who are near as well as those who are far away. And they must especially beware of themselves. For in overcoming themselves, they will be more easily subdued. Persons who would be truly spiritual must renounce both those who are near as well as those who are far away, and they must especially beware of themselves. For in overcoming themselves, they will the more easily subdue all things else. The most noble and perfect victory is the triumph over one's self. Therefore, persons who keep themselves in subjection so that their sensuality obeys their reason, and their reason is obedient to me, and all things are indeed the true conquerors of themselves and the lords of the world. If you would climb to this height of spirituality, you must begin heroically by laying the axe to the root in order to cut away and destroy utterly those secret and uncontrolled inclinations toward yourself and toward every personal and material gain. From this vice of self-love emanates almost all that must be uprooted and overcome. Once this has been mastered and brought under control, you will know a great peace and tranquility. But there are few who endeavor to die completely to themselves and to rise above their own nature. Therefore, they are so centered on themselves as to make it almost impossible to be lifted in spirit above themselves. Persons who really desire to walk freely with me must mortify all their evil and unnecessary affections and must not cling selfishly to anything created of this world. There is an opposition between nature and grace. Oh, nature and grace are completely opposing. God says, "My child, carefully observe the actions of nature and grace, for both move in opposite directions and in such a subtle way as to be indistinguishable except by the spiritually enlightened." So I will step aside from what is God is clearly speaking and say, in the spiritual collective, in the spiritual community, this is very important. So please pay attention to this in terms of readers, in terms of light workers, healers in the community. There's a huge difference between nature and grace, and who is still doing what they're doing for nature, for their own desires, versus who has the mark of grace over them in this community. So it's important to ask God for discernment in who you seek help from, who you take advice from, who you are following, because not all people or situations have the mark of God's grace. So God says, "My child, carefully observe the actions of nature and grace, for both move in opposite directions and in such a subtle way as to be distinguishable except by the spiritually enlightened. A human being long, all human beings long after goodness and pretend there is some good in what they say or do. That is why many are deceived by an apparent goodness. Nature indeed is wily and betrays many through its deceits in crafty ways, and has always self as its end. On the other hand, grace walks with simplicity, turning aside from all that appears evil. It employs no deceit, but does all unaffectedly, purely for God in whom it rests. Nature dies hard and is not easily overcome or repressed. Never under its own accord will it be subject to obedience. But grace studies how to be mortified to both the world and the flesh, desires to be overcome and under obedience, and seeks not its own liberty, nor to dominate any creature. Grace always wants to live under God's direction, and for his sake to place itself humbly under every human creature. Nature always looks to its own advantage, considering what gain it can derive from another. But grace is not concerned with its own profit, but with what may benefit others. Nature looks for honor and respect. Grace refers all honor and reverence to God. Nature fears rebukes and contempt. Grace is happy to suffer trials, tribulations, and adversity for the name of God. Nature craves ease and idleness, but grace cannot be idle and gladly embraces toil and turmoil. Nature surrounds itself with rare and costly things and looks down upon what is coarse and cheap. Grace takes joy in humble and simple things, does not disdain hard things, nor refuses to be clad in poor clothing. Nature focuses its attention on worldly matters, is elated by material gains, is downcast by losses, and is cut to the quick by a sharp word. Grace is intent upon things eternal, is not worried by the loss of things, nor grieved by the unkind words. For its treasure and joy are in heaven, where nothing is lost. Nature is greedy and gladly takes rather than gives, and clings possessively to private possessions. But grace is kind and unselfish, avoids self-interest, is content with little, and rightly judges that it is more blessed to give than to receive. Nature is inclined to seek creatures, to the love of its own flesh, to idle pastimes, and to unnecessary running about. Grace draws people toward the love of God and virtuous living, renounces all created things, flees the world, and despises the lust of the flesh, restrains all useless wanderings, and avoids as much as possible appearing in public. Now, that doesn't mean that those who are of high standing or in a place of success or renowned in some way. It's just the intent of the heart, and how do you use that platform is what God sees. Nature gladly receives exterior comforts to gratify the senses, but grace seeks comfort only in God, finding delight in the sovereign good beyond all things visible. Nature does everything for personal profit, never doing any work for nothing, but always looking for repayment at least an equal amount, if not better, or else for praise and favor, and longs to have its deeds and words highly valued. On the other hand, grace seeks no temporal reward nor any other compensation and payment, but only God Himself. Grace will have no more of the necessities of life than that which serves to obtain everlasting life. Nature enjoys having a crowd of relatives and friends, prides itself on the family tree and a distinguished background. Nature flatters the rich and caters to those in power and approves those who share the same opinions as itself. But grace behaves differently, for it loves even its enemies and does not boast of having a large circle of friends. It cares not for rank or birth unless joined with greater virtue. It favors the poor rather than the rich, and has more in common with the simple and the innocent than with the influential. It rejoices with the truthful and not the liars. It encourages the good to be zealous, to aim higher, and by the exercise of virtue to become more like God our Lord. As soon as trouble and want appears, nature is quick to complain. Grace gladly bears poverty and constancy. Nature refers all things to itself, and all its striving is for itself, but grace refers all things back to God, who is their source. Grace is not presumptuous and attributes no good to self. Neither does grace argue to prefer its own opinion, but submits to eternal wisdom. Nature wants to know secrets and is avid for news, wants to appear in public and to try out new things. It likes to be noticed and to do sensual and sensational things to win approval. Grace cares nothing for the novel or curious, for it knows that all these things spring from our old corruption, since there's nothing new or lasting upon this earth. Grace teaches us to control our senses, to shun all vain pleasures and outward show, and humbly to hide anything that might win human admiration. In all knowledge and in all actions, grace seeks not only spiritual profit, but above all, the praise and honor of God, that He may be blessed in His gifts, which He freely bestows through His love. This grace is a supernatural light, a special gift of God. It is the proper mark of the elect and a pledge of eternal salvation. It lifts a person above the things of earth to the love of heavenly things, making a spiritual person of a worldling. The more nature is kept down and overcome, the more grace fills a human soul. And through new daily visitations by the divine, the soul is formed more and more to the image of God. In terms of the corruption of nature and the power of God's grace, this should be your request and your prayer to God. My God, you have made me in your own image and likeness. Grant me this grace which you have shown me to be so great and so necessary for my salvation. to overcome my corrupt nature, which drags me down to sin and the loss of my soul. In my flesh, I see the law of sin opposing the law of my mind, leading me into bondage, so that I incline more toward giving in to my sensual inclinations. Nor am I able to resist these passions unless your holy grace comes to my aid, infusing its fervor into my heart. In order to overcome nature, I need your grace in great abundance, for this nature of ours is ever prone to evil, even from its youth. For it was defiled by sin through the first man, and the penalty of that stain has descended upon all humankind. To think that the very nature you made so good and upright is now captured for sin and corruption to the extent that its purely natural inclinations always draws us toward evil and base desires, i.e., the root chakra, the lower nature, the 3D. And so the little strength and inclination to good still remaining are a small spark of fire hidden among the ashes. This is our natural reason which, through and though surrounded by much darkness, it is still able to discern good from evil and the true from the false. Yet it is unable to carry out all it approves, nor does it possess the full light of truth or its former wholesome affections. Hence it is, my God, that inwardly in my soul I take delight in your law and in your teachings, for I know what you command is good, just, and holy, both for the reproval of all evil and for the avoidance of all sin. Yet when I prefer to obey my senses rather than my reason, I serve the law of sin. From this, it follows that though I will to do good, because of my weakness, I fail to accomplish it. Thus, I often take good resolutions, but because grace is lacking to me, in my weakness, I often turn back and yield to the slightest resistance. I know the way of perfection and can see clearly what I ought to do, but weighed down by the burden of my corruption, I do not rise to heights of great perfection. Dear Lord, how absolutely necessary is your grace. Your grace is like a magnificent river, not only to begin that which is good, but to persevere with it and to accomplish it. Without you, I can do nothing, but with your grace strengthening me, I can do all things. O grace, without which our own merits are worthless and the gifts of nature valueless, truly it is from heaven that this comes to us. There are no arts, beauty, strength, or riches, no ability or eloquence. None of these can help me, Lord,